At high noon, two gunslingers square off in the dusty street, hands hovering over their revolvers. A tumbleweed rolls by. The town falls silent. But here's the brutal truth. Real Wild West duels were far from Hollywood's romantic ballet of death. They were often drunken, messy affairs that ended in back shooting, ambushes from behind saloon doors, or point-blank executions. The real stories of these deadly encounters will make you question everything you thought you knew about the honorable Old West showdown. When the lights dimmed in early 20th century movie theaters, audiences were transported to a mythical West where honor, speed, and precision ruled the dusty streets. The Hollywood quick-draw duel became more than just entertainment. It evolved into a powerful cultural touchstone that would forever distort our understanding of frontier justice. This carefully choreographed dance of death was born in the silent film era, pioneered by early Western stars like William S. Hart and Tom Mix. Hart, a former Shakespearean actor, brought theatrical gravitas to his gunfight scenes, establishing the now familiar ritual. The slow walk to position, the steely-eyed stare, and the lightning-fast draw. His 1916 film, Hell's Hinges, codified many of the tropes we now take for granted, including the dramatic way gunslingers would flex their fingers before reaching for their weapons. The transformation from historical reality to silver screen fantasy was cemented by John Ford's landmark films of the 1930s and 40s. Ford, working with iconic stars like John Wayne, understood that audiences craved a morality play in their westerns. The quick-draw duel provided the perfect climactic moment, a test of skill, courage, and moral righteousness where the fastest gun would prove to be the most virtuous soul. His 1939 masterpiece, Stagecoach, featured what many consider the template for all future Hollywood duels. Clean, dramatic, and decidedly gentlemanly. The choreography of these scenes became increasingly sophisticated as the genre matured. Cinematographers discovered that filming at slightly slower speeds could make the draws appear even faster when played back at normal speed. The rack focus technique, shifting focus from one gunfighter's face to another's, built tension while giving audiences time to invest emotionally in the outcome. Sound designers added the distinctive zing of bullets and the exaggerated leather creak of holsters, creating an audio vocabulary that became inseparable from the Western genre. By the 1950s, television westerns like Gunsmoke and The Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp were bringing stylized quick-draw duels into American living rooms on a weekly basis. These shows needed to produce episodes quickly and economically, leading to a standardization of the duel format: the challenge, the walk, the wait, and the draw. This repetition helped cement the quick-draw myth in the public consciousness, making it seem like a historical fact rather than a dramatic invention. The technical aspects of filming these duels became an art form in themselves. Directors employed specific camera angles to maximize drama. The low-angle shot making gunfighters loom larger than life, the extreme close-up on squinting eyes, perfected by Sergio Leone in his spaghetti westerns, and the wide shot establishing the space between combatants. These techniques created a ballet-like quality to the violence, sanitizing the brutal reality of frontier gunfights. Hollywood armorers developed special quick-draw holsters that never existed in the Old West, designed with modern materials and cuts to allow for impossibly fast draws. Stars like Hugh O'Brian, who played Wyatt Earp on television, would practice for hours with fast-draw experts, achieving speeds that would have been unthinkable with period-accurate equipment. The leather was thinner, the holsters cut higher, and the guns modified to allow for faster action, all in service of the spectacle. Marketing departments seized on the quick draw as a promotional tool. Advertisements boasted of actors' draw speeds measured in fractions of seconds. Stars would tour county fairs and rodeos, demonstrating their lightning-fast techniques to awestruck fans. Fast draw competitions became popular events, further blurring the line between Hollywood fantasy and historical reality. The quick draw myth gained such power that it began to influence how actual historical figures were remembered. Wyatt Earp, who lived long enough to serve as a consultant on early Western films, never claimed to be particularly fast with a gun during his active years as a lawman. However, later in life, perhaps influenced by the growing mythology, he began to emphasize speed and accuracy in his recollections. The Hollywood version of events was becoming more real than reality itself. This cinematic invention reached its philosophical peak in 1952's High Noon, where the ritual of the quick-draw duel became a meditation on duty, courage, and civilization itself. The film's famous real-time structure built towards a climactic gunfight that was both technically thrilling and deeply symbolic. The quick draw was no longer just a physical act. It had become a moral crucible. By the 1960s, even as Westerns began to take a more cynical turn, the quick draw duel remained central to the genre's grammar. Films like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly might have deconstructed Western myths, but they still relied on the dramatic power of the face-to-face gunfight. The quick draw had become too powerful a symbol to abandon entirely. This Hollywood creation has proven so enduring that it continues to influence our understanding of the Old West, despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary. Modern audiences may be surprised to learn that period accounts of actual gunfights rarely mention speed of drawing as a decisive factor. The Hollywood quick-draw duel represents one of the most successful pieces of historical revision in popular culture, a complete fabrication that has become more authentic than the truth it replaced. The power of this myth lies not just in its visual appeal, but in its ability to transform the messy, often inglorious violence of the frontier into a ritual of justice and redemption. Hollywood didn't just create a new way of depicting violence, it created a new way of understanding the American West itself, one that continues to resonate with audiences worldwide, even as historians work to separate fact from silver screen fiction. The numbers tell a story far removed from the bullet-riddled mythology of the American frontier. When we dig into the actual statistics of Old West gun deaths, a surprisingly different picture emerges, one that might disappoint fans of dime novels and Hollywood westerns, but fascinates historians and truth-seekers alike. Let's start with the most famous cattle town of them all, Dodge City, Kansas. Despite its reputation as the deadliest town in the West, Dodge City saw only 15 recorded murders during its most violent year, 1878. Even more surprising, during its entire wild period from 1876 to 1885, the average was just 1.5 gun deaths per year. In contrast, modern crime dramas would have you believe that undertakers were the busiest businessmen in town. Looking at other notorious frontier towns reveals similar patterns. Tombstone, Arizona, site of the legendary gunfight at the OK Corral, averaged only about 3 murders per year during its wildest period. Even accounting for its smaller population, this made it statistically safer than many modern American cities. The infamous gunfight itself, which spawned countless movie recreations, lasted just 30 seconds and was considered shockingly violent by the standards of the day. court records and contemporary newspapers paint an even more revealing picture. In Abilene, Kansas, another supposedly deadly cow town, there were only 5 killings during its entire 2-year peak as a cattle shipping center, 1869 to 1870. Marshal Wild Bill Hickok, despite his fearsome reputation, only killed 2 men during his tenure there, and one was an accidental shooting of his own deputy. Approximately 65 to 70% of gun deaths were ambushes or shots in the back. About 20% occurred in closed spaces like saloons or brothels. Less than 10% were fair fights or traditional duels. The timing of these incidents rarely matched high noon. Most recorded shootings happened either late at night or in the early morning hours, typically fueled by alcohol and gambling disputes. The notion of professional gunfighters facing off at midday was largely a creation of dime novelists and later film directors. When examining death records from major frontier towns between 1870 and 1885, researchers found that accidental gun discharges often claimed more lives than intentional shootings. The combination of primitive firearm safety features and the widespread habit of carrying loaded weapons led to numerous unintentional deaths that rarely make it into Western narratives. Personal diaries and letters from the period suggest that most citizens in frontier towns never witnessed a gunfight during their entire lives. Many expressed surprise when violence did erupt, indicating that such events were notable exceptions rather than daily occurrences. This contrasts sharply with the popular image of the Wild West as a constant powder keg of potential violence. Law enforcement records provide another perspective. In most cattle towns, the most common arrests were for drunk and disorderly conduct, followed by petty theft. Violent crimes involving firearms made up a relatively small percentage of overall law enforcement activity. Many towns had strict gun control ordinances, requiring visitors to check their weapons with the sheriff or saloon keeper, a historical fact that rarely makes it into popular depictions. Professional gunfighters, those mythological figures of the Old West, were exceedingly rare. Most individuals famous for their gunfighting prowess were actually lawmen, outlaws, or military veterans who had relatively few actual gunfights. The profession of gunslinger basically didn't exist outside of dime novels. The racial and ethnic breakdown of gun violence presents another overlooked aspect. Native Americans and Mexican Americans were disproportionately represented among victims, often in confrontations that went unrecorded in official statistics. These deaths, while tragically common, didn't fit the narrative of white gunfighters facing off in dusty streets and were frequently ignored by contemporary chroniclers. When comparing frontier violence to other periods, historians have found that the murder rate in many eastern cities during the same period was actually higher than in most western towns. New York, Boston, and Chicago often experienced more gun violence than their frontier counterparts, though these statistics didn't capture the public imagination in the same way. Perhaps most telling is the reaction of contemporary citizens to gun violence when it did occur. Newspaper accounts from the period often express shock and outrage at shootings, suggesting that such events were considered extraordinary rather than commonplace. Business leaders and civic organizations frequently campaigned for stricter gun control measures, worried that their town's violent reputations would discourage investment and settlement. This statistical reality of Wild West gun deaths presents a complex challenge to our cultural memory. While violence was certainly present on the frontier, it was neither as frequent nor as ritualistic as popular culture would have us believe. The real West was a place where sudden, unglamorous violence occasionally erupted, but where most citizens lived their entire lives without ever drawing a weapon in anger. Understanding these statistics doesn't diminish the drama of the Old West, but rather helps us appreciate the real challenges and complexities faced by frontier communities. The true story, told through numbers and records, reveals a West that was simultaneously more civilized and more brutally pragmatic than its mythological counterpart. The legend of Wild Bill Hickok stands as perhaps the most illuminating case study in separating Wild West myth from murderous reality. While Hollywood and dime novels painted him as the quintessential quick-draw artist, the true stories of his gunfights reveal a much darker and more pragmatic approach to frontier violence. The most famous of Hickok's documented gunfights, his showdown with Davis Tutt in Springfield, Missouri, in 1865, is often cited as the closest real-life approximation to the classic Western duel. But even this relatively honorable encounter bears little resemblance to Hollywood's portrayal. The dispute began over a gambling debt and Hickok's prized gold watch, which Tutt had taken as collateral. After days of rising tensions and public insults, the confrontation wasn't a quick-draw affair at all. Instead of the familiar noon showdown, the fight occurred at 6 p.m. in the town square. Witnesses described both men as visibly nervous, their hands shaking as they faced each other from a distance of about 75 yards, far longer than the intimate range depicted in movies. Rather than the lightning-fast draw and fire, both men actually took careful aim. Hickok used his left arm to steady his pistol, while Tutt fired first and missed. Hickok's return shot struck Tutt in the heart, making it more a test of marksmanship than speed. The aftermath of this killing reveals much about the real nature of frontier justice. Unlike the movie versions where the victor walks away while the crowd disperses, Hickok immediately surrendered to authorities. He was charged with manslaughter and stood trial, where he was eventually acquitted under the fair fight doctrine of the time. This legal proceeding, rather than the gunfight itself, established many of the precedents for self-defense claims in the Old West. But it's Hickok's other encounters that truly shatter the Hollywood mythology. In 1861, when he was still known as Duck Bill for his protruding nose, Hickok killed 3 men in a close-quarters brawl at Rock Creek Station, Nebraska. There was nothing glamorous about this fight. It involved a wrestling match over a gun, multiple shots fired at point-blank range, and Hickok possibly killing one man with a knife. The entire affair was so messy that arguments about who killed whom continued for decades. During his time as a lawman in Abilene, Kansas, Hickok's most notorious killing was that of Phil Coe in 1871. Far from a fair fight, the shooting occurred in the chaos of a crowd, with multiple people firing weapons. Hickok shot Coe twice in the stomach, but in the confusion, he also accidentally killed his own deputy, Mike Williams, who was running to his aid. This tragic mistake haunted Hickok for the rest of his life and contributed to his increasing reliance on alcohol. What's particularly revealing about Hickok's career is how he actually avoided confrontations whenever possible. Despite his reputation, he's only confirmed to have killed 6 or 7 men in his entire life, a far cry from the dozens claimed by dime novels. He was known to resolve most conflicts through intimidation and negotiation, rather than violence. When he did resort to his guns, it was usually with overwhelming force and little warning. Hickok's personal habits also contradict the Hollywood image. Rather than standing tall and facing threats head-on, he preferred to sit in corners with his back to the wall, watching doorways and windows for potential threats. He was known to draw his pistols at the slightest provocation, often keeping them in his lap under a tablecloth. This paranoid behavior suggests a man who understood all too well the treacherous nature of frontier violence. The ultimate irony of Wild Bill's story lies in his death. On August 2nd, 1876, while playing poker in Deadwood's Nuttall and Mann's saloon, Hickok broke his own rule about sitting with his back to the wall. Jack McCall, a small-time troublemaker, walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. Hickok died instantly, his final hand of aces and eights becoming known as the dead man's hand. This inglorious end, murdered from behind while gambling, stands in stark contrast to the Hollywood myth of the unbeatable gunfighter. The aftermath of Hickok's death further illustrates the real nature of frontier justice. McCall was initially acquitted after claiming Hickok had killed his brother, despite no evidence supporting this claim. He was later recaptured, tried again, this time in a different territory, avoiding double jeopardy, and hanged. The entire episode revealed more about the limitations of frontier law enforcement than any notion of swift justice. The transformation of Hickok's actual experiences into legend began even before his death. Dime novelists like Ned Buntline had already begun publishing heavily embellished accounts of his exploits. Hickok himself contributed to this myth-making in his later years, often embellishing stories for eager listeners. But the real power of his legend grew after his death, as writers and eventually filmmakers transformed his practical, often brutal approach to violence into something more noble and sporting. Today, Wild Bill Hickok serves as a perfect lens through which to view the distortion of Western violence. His actual career, marked by ambushes, accidents, and pragmatic brutality, bears little resemblance to the Hollywood version of the gentleman gunfighter. Yet, it's precisely this transformation from historical figure to cultural icon that helps us understand how the myths of the Old West were created and why they continue to captivate audiences, even as they lead us further from the truth. The Hollywood quick draw might look impressive on screen, but the actual weapons of the Old West tell a far different story. The limitations, quirks, and outright dangers of period firearms reveal why the iconic fast-draw duel was more fiction than fact, and why most real gunfighters preferred ambush to face-to-face confrontation. The most popular sidearm of the era, the Colt single-action Army revolver, nicknamed the Peacemaker, was a mechanical marvel for its time, but posed significant challenges for anyone attempting a quick draw. Weighing nearly 3 pounds when fully loaded, its considerable heft made it unwieldy for the kind of lightning-fast draws seen in movies. The hammer had to be pulled back manually for each shot. There was no double-action capability that would allow both cocking and firing with a single trigger pull. Even more telling was the common practice of carrying these revolvers with only 5 rounds loaded, leaving the hammer resting on an empty chamber. This wasn't just an abundance of caution, it was a vital safety measure. The firing pin rested directly on the primer of any loaded round, and a sharp blow to the hammer could cause an accidental discharge. More than one gunfighter met their end when their pistol discharged after being dropped or struck against a saddle horn. The accuracy of these weapons was another far cry from Hollywood depictions. While the Colt was capable of reasonable accuracy in controlled conditions, the crude fixed sights and heavy trigger pull made rapid fire more a matter of luck than skill. Period accounts describe even experienced gunmen missing their targets at ranges as close as 10 feet during actual gunfights. The stress of combat, combined with the weapon's inherent limitations, meant that most real gunfights involved multiple shots fired with few hitting their intended targets. Loading these weapons was a time-consuming process that would have made Hollywood-style gunfights impractical. Each round had to be loaded individually through a loading gate, and spent cartridges had to be manually ejected one at a time using the ejector rod. A skilled handler might reload in a minute or so, but this was far from the rapid reloading depicted in films. Many gunfighters carried multiple revolvers rather than attempt to reload in the heat of battle. The ammunition itself posed numerous challenges. Early cartridges were notoriously unreliable, with misfires being a common occurrence. The black powder used in these rounds produced thick smoke that could obscure vision after just a few shots, another reason why prolonged gunfights were rare. The smoke also left a heavy residue that could foul the mechanism, making regular cleaning essential for reliable operation. The leather holsters of the period were designed for security and protection of the weapon, not quick drawing. They were typically made of thick, heavy leather that would protect the gun from weather and wear. The tight fit and high ride position typical of period holsters made fast draws physically impossible. The low-slung, open-topped holsters favored by movie cowboys would have been impractical in the real West, where riders needed their guns secured against the jolts and bumps of horseback riding. Even the basic mechanics of the quick draw were compromised by period technology. The hammer spur, while necessary for cocking the weapon, could easily catch on clothing during a draw. The front sight, essential for accuracy, was another potential snag point. These physical limitations meant that any attempt at a fast draw risked fumbling the weapon, or, worse, an accidental discharge. Temperature extremes common in the West affected weapon reliability. Cold could thicken the lubricants used in the mechanism, while heat and dust could create a gummy residue that impeded smooth operation. More than one gunfight ended before it began because a weapon failed to fire or became jammed due to environmental conditions. The prevalence of counterfeit and poor-quality weapons added another layer of uncertainty. While Colts and Smith & Wessons were the preferred brands, many settlers and gunfighters had to make do with cheaper alternatives. These knockoffs were often dangerous to their users, with soft metal parts that could fail catastrophically under stress. Tales exist of barrels bursting or cylinders cracking during use, injuring or killing the shooter rather than their intended target. Modification of weapons was common, but often made them less reliable. Some gunfighters would file down the trigger spring to achieve a lighter pull, while others would smooth the internal parts in an attempt to achieve a faster action. These modifications often resulted in misfires or accidental discharges. The most dangerous modification was filing down the firing pin safety notches, a practice that made the weapon more likely to discharge if dropped. The physical act of drawing and firing required more dexterity than strength. The weight and balance of period revolvers meant that a controlled draw was more effective than a fast one. The myth of the lightning-fast draw ignores the practical reality that pulling a weapon too quickly often resulted in dropping it or missing the target completely. Period accounts suggest that deliberate, practiced movement was far more important than raw speed. Many experienced gunmen modified their techniques to account for these limitations. Rather than relying on quick draws, they might keep their weapon in hand when trouble seemed likely. Some would draw surreptitiously before a confrontation began. Others carried smaller, less powerful weapons in easier-to-reach locations as backup. These pragmatic approaches acknowledge the technical limitations of their firearms. Understanding these weapon limitations helps explain why real Western gunfights bore little resemblance to their Hollywood counterparts. The technical constraints of period firearms encouraged ambush tactics, close-range shooting, and the use of overwhelming force rather than one-on-one duels. The myth of the quick-draw artist, while dramatically appealing, simply wasn't practical given the tools available in the Old West. The real art of the gunfighter wasn't in fast draws or fancy shooting, but in understanding and working around the limitations of their weapons. The relationship between alcohol and gun violence in the Old West was so intertwined that separating the two becomes nearly impossible when studying period accounts. While Hollywood depicts clear-headed gunslingers making calculated decisions in their deadly encounters, the reality was far messier, with whiskey playing a starring role in most frontier killings. Frontier saloons served raw spirits that would shock modern drinkers. The typical whiskey contained approximately 100 proof alcohol, often cut with everything from tobacco juice to gunpowder to give it more bite. This rot gut wasn't just strong, it was frequently toxic. Cases of temporary blindness, paralysis, and even death from bad liquor were common enough that most towns had ordinances against selling poisoned spirits, though enforcement was spotty at best. The famous Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City went through an average of several hundred gallons of whiskey per month during cattle season. When we examine court records from the period, roughly 80% of all shooting incidents involved at least one participant who had been drinking heavily. Marshal Wyatt Earp himself noted in his memoirs that most of the trouble he encountered came not from hardened criminals, but from otherwise peaceful citizens who had too much to drink. Take the case of the infamous Luke Short Jim Courtright gunfight in Fort Worth. While it's often portrayed as a professional dispute between two gunmen, witnesses reported that Courtright had been drinking heavily throughout the day, leading up to the confrontation. His judgment impaired, he made the fatal mistake of trying to strong-arm Short into paying for protection. The resulting shootout was quick and messy, with Courtright's drunken state likely contributing to his slow draw and fatal hesitation. Saloon culture itself contributed to the volatile mixture of alcohol and firearms. Many establishments operated 24 hours a day during peak seasons, with gamblers and drinkers often staying awake for days at a time, fueled by whiskey and coffee. Sleep deprivation combined with alcohol created a perfect storm for poor decision-making and hair-trigger responses to perceived insults. The practice of treating, buying rounds for everyone in the house, meant that drinking wasn't just a personal choice, but a social obligation. Refusing a drink could be seen as an insult, leading to the very confrontations many wished to avoid. Some clever frontiersmen developed tricks like secretly pouring their drinks into spittoons or arranging with bartenders to serve them colored water, just to avoid both drunkenness and offense. Temperature played a crucial role in this deadly mixture. Most saloons lacked adequate cooling in summer or heating in winter. In the scorching heat of a Texas afternoon, alcohol's dehydrating effects were magnified. During winter, men drinking to stay warm often didn't realize how intoxicated they were becoming. Both conditions led to faster intoxication and poorer judgment. The infamous shootout at Hyde Park in Newton, Kansas, serves as a perfect example of how alcohol escalated violence. What began as a simple dispute over a card game turned into a bloodbath after hours of drinking. By the time the smoke cleared, 8 men were dead or wounded, and most survivors couldn't give a coherent account of what had happened or who had shot whom. Gambling, another staple of saloon life, became exponentially more dangerous when mixed with alcohol. Card players would drink to steady their nerves or cope with losses, leading to increasingly poor decisions and paranoid accusations of cheating. The combination of alcohol, gambling debts, and readily available firearms created a predictably lethal equation. Town councils often tried to address this volatile mixture through ordinances. Many required cowboys to check their weapons when drinking, though enforcement varied widely. Some towns attempted to close saloons on Sundays or limit operating hours, but these efforts usually failed in the face of economic reality. Saloons were often the primary source of tax revenue for frontier communities. The economics of frontier drinking contributed to the violence. Saloon owners, operating on thin margins, often watered down their whiskey or added dangerous additives to cut costs. This led to even more unpredictable behavior from drinkers. The practice of selling on credit, known as chalking it up, meant that drunken patrons could accumulate significant debts before being cut off, leading to disputes when payment was demanded. Medical records from the period reveal another disturbing aspect of alcohol-related violence. Gunshot wounds suffered in drunken encounters were often more severe than those from sober shootings, as intoxicated shooters tended to fire multiple times and at closer range. Additionally, victims who had been drinking had worse survival rates, as alcohol thinned their blood and complicated medical treatment. The morning after these drunken shootouts often brought a different kind of violence: legal proceedings. Courts struggled with cases involving alcohol, as it was difficult to determine self-defense claims when all parties were intoxicated. Some judges were notorious for handing down harsh sentences to drunken shooters, while others viewed alcohol-fueled violence as a regrettable but unavoidable aspect of frontier life. Contemporary accounts from Army officers, traveling businessmen, and other relatively sober observers consistently express shock at the central role of alcohol in frontier violence. Their letters and diaries describe scenes of ordinary men transformed into killers by the combination of whiskey, weapons, and wounded pride. The legacy of this deadly combination lives on in the way we remember the Old West. While popular culture may prefer to imagine strategic gunfights between clear-headed adversaries, the reality was far more tragic. Ordinary men, their judgment clouded by raw spirits and their inhibitions destroyed by alcohol, reaching for their guns to settle disputes they might have laughed off if sober. In this light, the real story of Old West violence becomes less about skill with a gun and more about the destructive impact of alcohol on frontier society. The legal framework surrounding dueling and gunfights in the Old West presents a fascinating paradox: a complex web of formal laws, informal customs, and practical compromises that often bore little resemblance to either Hollywood's depiction or our modern understanding of self-defense. The reality of frontier justice regarding armed confrontations was far more nuanced than the simple fastest gun wins mythology. Contrary to popular belief, most Western territories had strict laws governing the use of deadly force. By the 1870s, many frontier towns had ordinances requiring visitors to surrender their firearms to local law enforcement or hotel owners upon arrival. Dodge City, Kansas, despite its reputation for violence, posted prominent signs reading, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Similar laws existed in Tombstone, Deadwood, and other notorious frontier towns. The legal concept of self-defense in the Old West was surprisingly sophisticated. Courts generally followed the English common law tradition, which required that a person claiming self-defense prove they had a reasonable fear of death or grievous bodily harm, and that they had exhausted all reasonable means of escape before resorting to deadly force. This duty-to-retreat doctrine directly contradicted the Hollywood image of heroic gunfighters standing their ground. Take the aftermath of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral. While modern films portray it as a clear-cut case of lawmen versus outlaws, the legal proceedings that followed were complex and contentious. Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday faced murder charges, and their subsequent acquittal hinged not on any right to engage in a gunfight, but on careful legal arguments about immediate threat and reasonable response. Different territories had varying standards for what constituted justifiable homicide. New Mexico Territory was notably lenient, recognizing the concept of needed killing as an informal but effective defense. Texas, by contrast, maintained stricter standards, particularly in cases where the defendant had been drinking or had initiated the confrontation. The role of law enforcement in these matters was equally complex. Most frontier marshals and sheriffs operated with remarkable discretion in deciding which killings to investigate. A shooting between known troublemakers might receive minimal attention, while the death of a prominent citizen could trigger an extensive investigation. This discretionary justice system created an informal hierarchy of violence that favored established residents over transients and respected citizens over outcasts. Professional gamblers faced unique legal challenges. While gambling itself was often legal, deaths resulting from gambling disputes were treated more harshly by the courts. The reasoning was that anyone who chose to make their living by gambling had voluntarily entered a high-risk profession and therefore couldn't claim the same level of self-defense protection as ordinary citizens. The legal status of dueling itself presented another contradiction. While formal dueling with pistols, in the European tradition, was generally illegal throughout the West, informal street fights with firearms occupied a gray area. Many courts distinguished between premeditated duels and spontaneous gunfights, treating the former more severely. This led to the curious practice of participants and witnesses carefully crafting their testimony to present shootings as unplanned encounters rather than deliberate duels. Property rights complicated matters further. Saloon owners had broad latitude in dealing with troublesome customers, including the use of deadly force to protect their establishments. However, they could also be held liable for deaths that occurred on their premises if they had failed to take reasonable precautions, such as enforcing weapons checks or breaking up obvious confrontations. The treatment of witnesses in shooting cases reveals another aspect of frontier legal complexity. Courts often struggled with conflicting testimony, as witnesses frequently changed their stories based on personal allegiances or fear of reprisal. Some jurisdictions developed informal systems for weighing testimony, giving more credence to property owners and established citizens while discounting the words of drifters and known criminals. Time of day played a surprising role in legal proceedings. Shootings that occurred during daylight hours generally received more scrutiny than those happening late at night. The reasoning was that daylight shootings suggested premeditation, while nighttime violence could more easily be attributed to confusion or reasonable fear in the darkness. The legal handling of female shooters presented its own peculiarities. Women who used firearms in self-defense often received more lenient treatment from courts, particularly in cases involving defense against male attackers. However, this leniency didn't extend to women engaged in traditionally male pursuits like gambling or ranching. Interstate complications frequently arose in frontier justice. A killing deemed justified in one territory might be considered murder in another, leading to complex extradition battles. Some gunfighters exploited these jurisdictional differences, carefully choosing their ground for anticipated confrontations. The evolution of frontier gun laws reflected changing social conditions. As towns grew more established, their weapons regulations generally became stricter. However, enforcement often remained selective, with local authorities balancing public safety against the practical realities of frontier life and the economic interests of saloon owners and cattle barons. Court records from the period show that judges struggled to balance traditional legal principles with frontier realities. Some developed innovative solutions, such as requiring bonds from known troublemakers or imposing geographic restrictions on where armed individuals could go within city limits. These practical compromises helped shape the development of modern self-defense law. The legacy of this legal framework continues to influence American gun law today, particularly in debates over stand-your-ground legislation and the right to carry firearms in public places. The tension between formal law and practical reality that characterized frontier justice remains evident in modern discussions of self-defense and the role of firearms in society. Understanding this complex legal landscape helps explain why real Western gunfights bore little resemblance to their fictional counterparts. Participants had to consider not just their immediate survival, but the legal consequences of their actions, leading to a more cautious and calculated approach to armed confrontation than Hollywood would have us believe. The psychology of real gunfighters presents a stark contrast to the cool, collected heroes of Western fiction. These were often deeply troubled men, haunted by their experiences and struggling with what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, alcoholism, and a host of other psychological issues that arose from living in a state of constant vigilance and repeated exposure to violence. Take John Wesley Hardin, one of the West's most notorious gunfighters. His writings from prison reveal a man plagued by paranoid thoughts and recurring nightmares. He would wake in cold sweats, reaching for guns that weren't there, convinced that old enemies were coming for him. This wasn't the stoic demeanor of a Hollywood gunslinger, but the shattered psyche of a man who had killed between 20 and 40 people and lived in constant fear of retribution. The psychological toll of taking human life was often devastating, even for those who killed in self-defense or the line of duty. Wyatt Earp, contrary to his portrayal as an unflappable lawman, suffered from insomnia and was known to drink heavily in his later years. In rare moments of candor, he admitted to being haunted by the faces of men he'd killed, particularly those from the Tombstone period of his life. Contemporary accounts describe many notorious gunfighters exhibiting what we now recognize as hypervigilance, a state of increased awareness and anxiety that's a common symptom of PTSD. They would sit with their backs to walls, constantly scan their surroundings, and react with extreme aggression to sudden movements or unexpected noises. This wasn't the calculated caution of fictional heroes, but a psychological wound that made normal life nearly impossible. The phenomenon of quick-trigger nerves was well documented in frontier accounts. Gunfighters who had survived multiple encounters often developed an almost pathological readiness to use deadly force. Their threat assessment mechanisms permanently altered by repeated exposure to life-or-death situations. What might seem like lightning-fast reflexes to observers was often a manifestation of severe psychological trauma. Doc Holliday's famous volatility makes more sense when viewed through the lens of modern psychology. An educated dentist dying of tuberculosis, his embrace of a violent lifestyle wasn't just about survival or reputation. it showed signs of what we'd now call death-seeking behavior. His reckless courage in gunfights likely stemmed from a complex relationship with his own mortality. The isolation experienced by known gunfighters contributed to their psychological deterioration. Many found themselves unable to form lasting relationships or trust others, knowing that their reputation made them constant targets. This social isolation often led to depression and increased alcohol use, creating a vicious cycle of psychological distress and violent behavior. Letters and diaries from the period reveal that many gunfighters struggled with what we now call moral injury, the psychological trauma of having violated their own moral codes. Even those who killed in seemingly justified circumstances often grappled with guilt and questioned their actions. This inner conflict rarely appears in fictional accounts, but was a common theme in real gunfighters' personal writings. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate aftermath of violence. Many survivors of gunfights reported experiencing time distortion during the events. Moments that lasted seconds in reality seemed to stretch for minutes in their memory. This phenomenon, now recognized as a common response to extreme stress, often led to conflicting accounts of the same event and contributed to the psychological burden of survivors. Family members and close associates of gunfighters frequently noted personality changes following violent encounters. The confident, sociable individual might become withdrawn and suspicious. Some developed obsessive behaviors, like compulsively checking their weapons or refusing to sit in certain positions. These changes often persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. The coping mechanisms employed by frontier gunfighters were often maladaptive. Heavy drinking was common, as was gambling, activities that provided temporary escape from psychological torment, but ultimately exacerbated their problems. Some turned to religion or moved frequently, seeking redemption or trying to outrun their memories. The myth of the professional gunfighter persists because it's more romantic than the reality. The truth is that most frontier violence was perpetrated by ordinary men who had other jobs and simply carried guns as tools or for self-defense. The few who tried to make a career solely of their gun-handling skills either died young or found other ways to make a living. Looking back, the entire concept of professional gunfighting appears to be largely a creation of Eastern publishers and Hollywood screenwriters, rather than a genuine frontier phenomenon. The real business of the Old West was business itself: ranching, mining, commerce, and all the ordinary occupations that built the American frontier. Women in gun violence in the Old West paints a starkly different picture than the demure saloon girls and schoolmarms of Hollywood westerns. These frontier women were often as deadly as their male counterparts, though their stories have been largely overshadowed by male-centered narratives. Take the case of Belle Starr, known as the Bandit Queen. While popular culture remembers her mostly for her romantic entanglements, she was a skilled shooter who commanded respect in outlaw territories. Court records show she didn't hesitate to use her weapons, though she was clever enough to often avoid direct confrontation, preferring intimidation to actual bloodshed. Pearl Hart broke all Victorian-era stereotypes when she committed one of the last stagecoach robberies in the Old West. Armed with a .38 revolver, she didn't just participate in the robbery. She planned and executed it with military precision. When captured, she famously quipped that she could handle a gun as well as any man, a claim supported by witnesses to the robbery. The social rules governing women's involvement in violence were complex and often contradictory. A woman defending her homestead with a rifle was considered admirable, while one who engaged in offensive violence was seen as unnatural. Yet, this didn't stop numerous women from becoming proficient with firearms and using them when necessary. Laura Bullion, known as the Rose of the Wild Bunch, was not just a companion to outlaws but an active participant in gunfights. Bank records and witness accounts confirm her involvement in several violent robberies, where she proved just as capable with a six-shooter as any male gang member. Her skill with firearms earned her equal shares in the gang's spoils. The most fascinating cases often involved women who used the period's gender expectations to their advantage. Some would hide weapons in their voluminous skirts, counting on men's reluctance to search a lady. Others would play the role of distressed damsel to lure victims into ambushes, a tactic that proved devastatingly effective. Rose Dunn, known as Rose of the Cimarron, demonstrated how frontier women often straddled the line between lawful and outlaw society. While she was known to participate in gunfights alongside the Doolin Dalton gang, she also saved her lover's life during a shootout with marshals, proven equally comfortable with both violence and mercy. The weapons chosen by female fighters often differed from their male counterparts. Many preferred smaller caliber revolvers that could be easily concealed in period clothing, or sawed-off shotguns that required less accuracy in close-quarter fighting. Some, like Calamity Jane, bucked this trend entirely, choosing to carry the same heavy revolvers as male gunfighters. Court records reveal an interesting pattern in how violence by women was treated legally. Juries were often more lenient with female defendants who used firearms in self-defense, but paradoxically harsher on those who engaged in premeditated violence. This legal double standard influenced how many frontier women chose to employ their weapons. The role of women in gang violence was particularly noteworthy. Many outlaw groups found that having female members provided tactical advantages. Women could gather intelligence, secure supplies, and move through towns without arousing suspicion in ways men couldn't. When violence erupted, these same women often proved just as deadly as their male counterparts. Perhaps most telling are the contemporary accounts of male gunfighters' reactions to armed women. While some dismissed them, the smarter ones learned to be especially wary. As one Texas Ranger reportedly noted, "A lady with a gun is twice as dangerous. She's got something to prove and society's expectations to defy." The legacy of these armed women of the Old West continues to challenge our understanding of frontier violence. They weren't just exceptions to the rule. They were an integral part of the complex tapestry of Western gun culture. Their stories remind us that the frontier was a place where survival often depended more on skill and determination than on gender, and where a woman's trigger finger could be just as steady as a man's. These women's stories serve as a vital reminder that frontier violence wasn't exclusively a male domain, and that understanding the full scope of Old West gun culture requires looking beyond the traditional male-centered narratives that have dominated popular culture for so long.